Hi everyone, it is Julian from QSC Dynamics and welcome to part 3 of the risk management series where we are going to get into assessing risks now. So in part 1, we know what the business does, who's involved and the stakeholders. The second part, we have now identified the hazards applicable to the business. So now we get to start putting it together and really determining what those risks are and how we can prioritize them. So we'll go through a range of different tools and pretty much just those key principles, just like we did in the past few parts, to really help in determining where your risks lie. And then in part 4, we'll talk about controlling. But for now, we'll just have a look at that assessing point. We will start by choosing our assessment categories. That will make more sense in the next slide, but this should really be close to the types of hazards that you have identified. Next, we'll talk about applying different risk principles. So we're pretty much just going to go over the basics here, but they're tried and tested, so it's a really good refresher. And then we'll start putting together our risk matrix, or you may want to call it your rating tool, and we'll talk about the different pros and cons of different types, and also delve a little bit deeper into some of the areas of these tools that don't really get enough attention. And so we'll look at these and then we'll see how we can better improve these to make more sense for your business. We are going to start by determining what kind of categories we want to be able to assign a risk rating to. So in this example, we have quality in business, so we can start putting together metrics for reputation, financial cost, market share, safety, of course, human injury and illness, and then environmental, so waste generation, flora and fauna. So let's start putting this together to see how it starts looking when we put this into practice. And here are those risk categories just starting to take shape on the first part of our risk rating tool. All I've done is literally taken a description of each one and popped it on the top. You can, by all means, have a play around with this, determine which headings make sense for you. For the rest of this example, we will just use these ones. And now that we have our topics that we are going to risk assess, it's now time to apply our risk principles, and it comes down to the good old probability and consequence. So how or what are the chances of the hazard causing an incident? And if it were to actually cause an incident, what would that outcome be? There's no reason why you have to make it overly complicated. Probability and consequence is just such a tried and true method. So let's first look at the consequence. So a lot of risk rating tools don't give a very good description of consequences. I prefer a tool that is very descriptive. That way, when somebody is determining a risk rating, they have the proper guidance needed to make a good informed decision. So let's go back to our table now that we've got our categories and have a look at how you may want to do that. Now, looking back at our table, it's really clear to see that with our consequences, we have more clearer descriptions of what they are. So if we look at business continuity, a major is something that has an impact of more than 1 month. It's very clear cut. We know exactly what it means. And these are by no means some kind of hard and fast rule. You can actually determine these internally and figure out, well, okay, major, what does that mean for the business? Insignificant, what kind of risk tolerance does that entail? So it does take a bit more time and a bit more thought to put together, but I guarantee you it is a much more useful and worthwhile tool to have. We will do the same for probability, where we want to be able to have really good, clear, concise descriptions. So a good example is the term unlikely. What does that actually mean? For me, it could mean once a year. Somebody else could mean once every 5 years. So it's a word that we often throw around a bit, whether it's likely, unlikely, possible, but we don't seem to really give enough weight to these types of wordings. So let's try giving it a bit more clarity. And that's what's been done here. You can see that a rare type of probability has a frequency of once in 100 years, and then almost certain is a couple of times a year. Again, you don't have to use this type of frequency descriptor. You can really have a think about how you want to frame this yourself. I have an example a little later on where it's more about if it's happened in the industry before, if it's happened internally before. Again, you can really think about how you want to be able to frame probability within your business. But I think it's important to at least try implementing some kind of accurate description to guide people through the risk management process. And now that we have our categories determined, we've got a really good understanding of what our probability is going to be, what our consequences are going to be. We can start putting together all of this into our risk matrix. And I think it's a really important thing to actually remember when we use a risk matrix. It sounds obvious at first, but there are a few really key times where we want to employ the risk matrix. We actually apply a risk rating to a hazard a number of times. So we want to know the level of risk in absence of all controls. So if nothing was implemented and we just kept doing the activity without any type of controls in place, well, what's the risk level there? Next, we want to know what the risk level is based on the controls implemented. So this is typically called your primary and your residual risk. And if your controls are effective enough, then you should be able to see a reduction in risk from the first time you've risk rated it to the second time you've risk rated it. And we can actually use our risk matrix when trying to determine levels of risk that we want to achieve. So you can actually place a target on it and say, well, okay, this particular hazard, I want to be able to reduce our risk to a target rating of low, for example. So you can have your primary without controls, then implement your controls, see if that reduces your level of risk, and then you can see against your targeted risk rating, well, okay, is our residual risk meeting our target goal? And before we have a look at a few risk matrix examples, do keep in mind you will not likely have a 100% accurate calculation all the time. We must make sure that our risk scores reflect essentially a reasonable evaluation. So what is a reasonable evaluation? Well, we take all the data that we can find on the hazard. We make sure we have the right consultation and participation. A lot of the types of principles that we discussed in part 2, we apply those to our risk matrix, and then based on that, we do hope that we can at least get a good enough indication of where our high, medium, and low priorities are. The first example is your fairly typical, I would say, 5x5 risk matrix, where we have our probability and our impact. So we've called it consequence here. You'll always see a variation in the types of words used. All means the same thing in this case. And there's a few things I like about this one. So one of them is the ability to have a difference between low and very low. I like the idea of splitting up that category. I think sometimes the low category is overused a bit, and it can make you think that there's no risk associated with anything that has been deemed low. One thing that I'm not necessarily that big of a fan of in general is when you have a scoring system which doesn't let you trace back what the classification was. And in this case, if we have a look at our 8 mediums, that's a good example. So an 8 medium could mean that something is likely but have a minor impact, but it could also mean that something is unlikely and have a major impact. And personally, I like being able to see the difference between those two. So if I'm looking at a risk assessment and I can see there's a medium 8, I can see exactly what the parameters are that are behind that selection. So it does make the risk rating tool a bit more, I wouldn't say complex, because it's never really that complex of a task, but it does mean that a bit more training is required for those using the risk tool, because they need to understand the methodology used behind why they've picked that particular scoring. Next up is one that looks somewhat similar to the first one, but you will notice if we just go back that the previous one is a 5x5 risk matrix, where on this one it's actually a 4x5, and we're using the term severity instead of impact in this one, and we have 4 categories. There's no reason why you can't use 4 categories. Again, I just want to stress the importance of having really good descriptors behind these. So marginal severity, I would really want to see what is defined as a marginal. Something that I like about this one is that it's very easy to use. Again, we can see that we do have some similar scoring. A serious 8 is in there a couple times, and then we got a high 12 a few times and whatnot. But again, it's really up to who you want to use this, how much training you're going to do, and how important that classification is to you. If you don't mind not knowing if a serious 8 is a moderate and a probable risk score, or a remote and catastrophic risk score, then by all means, if you're wanting to implement the same controls one way or another, then maybe that's a level of detail you don't necessarily need. Again, there's no hard and fast rules about this. Just make sure that you take this into consideration when putting together your risk matrix, so you really get out of it what you want. This one looks a bit different to the last two that we had a look at. And the one thing that I really like about this, actually there's a couple things, but firstly, the probability, the classification of A to D, it gives us a bit more of a description. So A has occurred in industry, so we can see maybe from external sources if something has typically occurred in the industry. And then B has occurred in operating company, so we can look internally to our incidents or our near misses, and then that helps us actually determine this probability. From a consequence side, I would be looking at a bit more description. So an example from people, you have this severity rating. A severity rating of 1 under people is slight injury. The severity rating 2 for people is minor injury. So for me, this is a little confusing. If there was a first aid injury, would we consider this a slight injury or minor? So maybe a few more descriptors of that would be nice. The good thing is that we can really determine from the color coding, which only gives us 3 options, but at least we can determine what that color means. We have the first one of manage for continued improvement. This kind of tells us that we can continue to manage it, but we may want to look at potentials for improving the situation if needs be. It could be worded maybe for a bit more clarity on that. We have our orange, so this is telling us we have to incorporate risk reducing measures, so it's a bit of a call to action. And then of course we get the same for red. We're saying failed to meet our screening criteria. Maybe it would be nice in this case to say it's failed to meet the criteria, stop work, or some kind of more stronger call to action. So if we fall on this, we know that we have to take additional actions. And now just lastly is an example that is more in my preference. Again, the keyword is preference, so that's not saying that this is perfect. There's all sorts of reasons why you'd want to do it differently, but I do like this for a number of reasons. So we can see that the numbering system, each different classification has a different number. So there is a difference between a 12 medium and a 13 medium. The benefit of this is as soon as you see that risk score being used, you know exactly what the user has picked, which I think is nice. And then depending on what the classification is, we actually have a quite detailed call to action here. So if something is low risk, we're saying, well, we can manage it through our routine procedures. And medium, there has to be some kind of management responsibility. We have to look at incorporating standard operating procedures, making sure that we really do cover these types of risks. High risk, we need to get more senior management involved. This way, there is some kind of escalation process, essentially. And then extreme risk is saying that we really have to do something about it now. And then, of course, we would, as per our previous examples, have good descriptions of what rare means up to almost certain and what insignificant means to major. So this is just another way of doing it, something that I prefer to use in some cases, might be a bit of overkill in others, but at least you've now seen a range of examples. So when you're putting together your matrix, you're thinking about all the different little variables which don't look so obvious just at face value, but can have a huge impact in how the tool is used and how risk ratings are perceived. So this is now going back to part 2, or our example there, where we had started putting together our risk register. And now you can see how this is combining quite well with our risk rating tool. For this example, again, we've only used safety related aspects. We would, of course, want environmental and quality if we are including that within our risk register. And we have now assigned a primary risk rating. So that's why they're quite high here, because it is the risk rating not considering the current or proposed controls. We will start building that component of it, which will start nearing the end or the completion of our risk register in part 4, when we start discussing the control of risks. And that concludes part 3. The 4th part will be released in about a week's time, and it'll start looking into the control of risks. So far, we have really started building that framework, and we can see how having the right kind of methodologies in play from the get-go really do give us good leverage on being able to systematically implement a risk management framework. So feel free to get in touch if you do have any questions. You can get in touch with me via the details that you can see in front of you, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye.